Hello, and welcome to Get to Know the Bible. Today we're going to be looking at First Samuel through First and Second Chronicles. And the whole idea of this series is to get you familiar with the story of the Bible. It is a story from Genesis to Revelation. All 66 books do connect to tell one overarching message of God's love and redemption for mankind. But sometimes it can be a little tricky, especially the Old Testament. But reading through all these books and how they kind of all fit together and so forth. So that goal is just to use people and places, archaeology, geography, history, and prophecy to kind of make it make sense as you read through Scripture, to tie it together so you can see how it all kind of fits. We're in the Old Testament right now. There's 39 books in our Old Testament. We have 5 different areas. We have the law, also called the Pentateuch, the Greek word, or the books of Moses, the first 5 books. We went through those in session 2. You can review that if you'd like, if you go with session 2. And then we went through Joshua to an introduction to First Samuel. And now today we're going to go from First Samuel through Second Chronicles. These 5 areas, we have the law, the historical books, the poetical wisdom books, and then the prophetical books, the major prophets and the minor prophets. Once again, the minor prophets are not less important. They're just smaller volumes. There's not as many words or chapters in their books. But we have 16 prophets in total. Jeremiah wrote Lamentations. We have 17 books, but 16 prophets. And we're going to be going through those next week. Okay, so let's do a quick review, and then we'll jump into today's area of the Bible. In the beginning, we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12. Abraham's called out of Ur, way down here in Sumeria, excuse me. And he's called all the way over here to Canaan, the promised land, and he obeys. So him and his family pack up, and they go up here to Haran, and this is where they stayed 5 years. Terah, his father, dies here. His brother Haran, there's 2 Harans. There's Haran the place, and Haran, the name of one of Abraham's brothers. He dies. We're not sure where or when, but Lot, his Haran's son, kind of becomes close to Abraham. That's why you see Lot journeying with Abraham all the way to Canaan. So they stay there 5 years, and then they head down to Canaan, and they settle the promised land. And that's middle of Genesis. And then we have Isaac's born, and then Jacob, and then Jacob, one of his sons, Joseph, is sold into slavery, then becomes second in command of Pharaoh, and the famine causes his brothers and his father to seek out food, and they come under his protection. And that's when the tribe, or the clan of Isaac and his 12 sons, Jacob and his 12 sons, kind of migrate, about 70 people or so, to Egypt, and they spend 400 years there, and that's where they kind of blew up into a big nation. But before we get into that part of the story, just a quick review. We have some geographical features to kind of point out in Canaan. Geography plays a big role in how these cities are located and how the stories play out. So it's good to have just a basic understanding of some of the geography of present day of Israel. We have the coastal plains, right? Kind of flat. Then we have this hill country of Judea and hill country of Ephraim, kind of this middle ridge of the country. Then you have the Jordan Valley, which is a big depression. It's actually below sea level. It's quite a drop from Galilee to the Dead Sea. And then we have the Transjordan Mountains and the Transjordan Plateau on the present-day Jordan side, the east side of the Jordan River. So that's kind of how it's kind of laid out. Then we have Galilee, the hill country of north and southern Galilee, and then you have Lebanon, and then you have Syria to the east. But most of the stories we're studying in this section are going to be right in this area here, hill country of Judea, Samaria, and the coastal plains. This is kind of how the road system looks when back in the patriarch times. You have the coastal highway, which kind of bifurcates into 2 and comes back along the ocean and comes up through Megiddo and Hazor over to Damascus. This is one of the main routes, trading routes. So you have this middle road that kind of goes along the spine or the ridge of the hills, the highlands of Israel. And that goes through Bethel and Gibeon and Hebron, all the way to Beth-shean and so forth. And then you have this King's Highway, this big thoroughway on the east side of the Jordan that goes from way down in Edom all the way through Damascus. And you can drive on it today. It's a major highway in present-day Jordan. So it's kind of the road systems, and why it's important, because it kind of makes sense where the cities are located. They're all located mostly on trade routes, and it's how it's all connected. So as you read through these cities in the Bible, and hopefully as we do review and you go through the series, you see the same places over and over again, it just kind of starts to stick where you can see it in your head. So when you're reading a story in the Bible about Hebron or about Dan or about Megiddo, you can kind of know exactly where it is and kind of say, oh, that makes sense, why that's happening there, why that battle's happening there, why this is going on, or what have you. So this is kind of how the roads are laid out. And then just give you an idea of the size of Israel. Israel's not that big. It just is about the size of New Jersey, actually. And so this is present day Google Maps. And there's a saying in the Bible, Dan to Beersheba. Dan to Beersheba. What that means is from the far north of Israel to the far south, Dan's in the north, Beersheba's in the south. So from Dan to Beersheba is kind of a saying that from all the way to the north, all the way to the south. You can see in Judges 20, verse 1, then all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead, and the congressional assembled as one man to the Lord at Mitzvah. And Mitzvah is just north of Jerusalem. So it's basically saying from Dan to Beersheba. Well, how far is that actually? Well, if you on a Google map, if you drive from present day Dan all the way down to Beersheba, it's a little under 3 hours. A little under 3 hours. And that's from the far north to the far south. So kind of give you just a little context there as far as size goes. And once again, this is kind of the southern part of Israel, kind of how it's kind of broken up. You have the coastal plains where the Philistines had settled and kind of controlled for a while. So it's called the Philistine coastal plains. You have the 5 main cities of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, Ekron, and Ashdod. And then you have the Shephelah, which is kind of this middle ground. As you go from the flat ocean area, it starts to climb to the hills. This middle area is called the Shephelah. Then you have the hill country of Judea, the land of Benjamin, where Jerusalem's located. And then north is the hill country of Ephraim. Then you have this thing called the Judean wilderness, way on the east side of the hill country of Judah. It's just desolate. It's where Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness being tempted by Satan. John the Baptist spent some time down here, but it's very, very desolate. Very desolate. Matter of fact, it's kind of what it looks like. As you can see, it's just not much there. There's really no trees, no shrubs. It's just rock. Just rock. So, as I mentioned, the clan of Isaac, at this point, the clan of Isaac, him and his 12 sons, came over to Goshen, to Egypt under Joseph's protection. And then Moses came to deliver them out of slavery. They were there 400 years. They became slaves in those 400 years, became this very large people group. Moses came. Once again, you can study it in week 2. We went through all this. But Moses went to Midian for 40 years and came back and got Pharaoh to let them go after the 10 plagues. They came into the Sinai, spent about a year or so working their way down to Mount Sinai at the bottom. Got the 10 commandments. That's when the Lord called the Israelites to be his covenant people. I now have a covenant with you. Here's the law. And that's why he gave them the book of Leviticus, which is all the priesthood and the tabernacle and how God was going to dwell with his people and have a relationship. Well, how do the people have a relationship with the holy God? These are all the steps that God set up to have that relationship. And that will happen down here in Mount Sinai. Then they journeyed north to Kadesh Barnea. So the 12 spies went into Israel. They came back. 10 of the spies says, we cannot go to Israel. The giants are big. The cities are fortified. Only Caleb and Joshua said, yes, we can. God will deliver us. Unfortunately, Moses and the people listened to the 10 that were negative. And so God says, if you don't trust me, this generation will not go into the promised land. And they spend the next 38 years traveling around the wilderness, waiting for the next generation to come up. Only Caleb and Joshua, the 2 spies that came back saying, we can take it. God's on our side. We can enter the promised land. The only 2 that were allowed to go into the promised land. So that happened here at Kadesh Barnea. Then they came down to Midian and came up and around. But if you look at Mount Sinai, this is where we got, this is kind of what it looks like in that area. It's very desolate as well. The Sinai is a very dry area. This is where they spent all these years wandering around. And this is also where they got the tabernacle, which we studied, 2 sessions ago, but it's going to come up a lot because you really need to understand the significance of the tabernacle. This was a tent. It's called the tent of meeting. This is what God gave the Israelites to have as a place that he will come and actually dwell with them. First time during the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, there was no God dwelling with them. This was set up for, now he's going to covenant. He had a covenant relationship. He's going to dwell with them. We have the altar, sacrificial altar of incense. You have the menorah and what's called the holy place and the shewbread. And then you have the Holy of Holies, which was like an inner part of the holy place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. This is where God would come down and meet with the high priest. And the high priest going once a year and for atonement of sins and so forth. So this Holy of Holies is called. Very important when we get to the Temple of Solomon and then we get to the New Testament times. This is all set up for the heart. This is all set up for the heart. What I mean by that, This was replaced by the temple, which we're going to see in a few, later in this presentation. This tabernacle was, Jerusalem. The temple was built in Jerusalem as a permanent place for God to dwell with his people. And then when that was wrecked by the Romans in AD 70, the temple was no more, Jerusalem was no more. Paul tells us in the New Testament that the new temple is our hearts. Jesus now dwells directly in us. So God, instead of having a tent to meet with people, instead of having a building like the temple to meet with people, he now meets directly through the Holy Spirit in the heart of people. So this is all set up to bring in the revelation of Jesus Christ and what he was going to do. So we're going to look at that a little bit. So we have the Israelites making their way through the wilderness. They come up around Edom and Moab, and then they go ahead and beat King Sihon and King Og of the Amorites and take over this area. And so this is what Israel had right before they entered the Promised Land. They had all this area east of the Jordan River. This place called Gilead. Kind of remember that. Gilead is anything east of the Jordan River between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And you have these different cities, Gilead, Ramoth, and Edom, and Ashdod. And Jesus does a lot of ministry over here when he's at the Decapolis and so forth. We'll get to that in a few weeks. But just kind of remember this Gilead area. So this is where Israel is before they go into the Promised Land under Joshua. They now enter the Promised Land, and this is kind of what they conquered. This is what they ended up taking. They're supposed to take all of it, didn't quite do it, didn't quite get it done, but they got a lot of it conquered. And that's kind of going to bring us up to where we are, because right after Joshua did the conquering, they did the division of the 12 tribes. This is what they're supposed to take the whole land, and the lands got allotted to the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the allotments. Once again, we went to this in the last session, so you can go review it. But as you can see, it takes up the whole area, but that's not actually what they conquered. They actually conquered just this. So some of the areas that were supposed to be allotted were still held by people groups like the Canaanites and the Philistines and the Hittites and so forth. Once Joshua dies, we have this period of 350 years or so where these judges come, and the judges rule Israel. And all the judges are just people that God raised up to deliver the Israelites from a particular foe. It wasn't a nationwide judge. It was just for a particular area, a particular region, or a particular tribe at a particular time. And so we have basically 12 major judges, and then we have Samuel, the last judge, which we're going to talk about today. But you can kind of go through, when you go through the slides, you can see in Judges where you can read about each judge and what they did. But that's this period of the judges, about 350 years after Joshua and the Israelites conquered the land, okay? And this is kind of a map showing judges, like where they actually judged, what part of Israel they were judging over. Once again, you can review that last session, look at the video. And we ended last session with an introduction to Samuel. So who's Samuel? Samuel was the last judge. So we go through this period of judges. Samuel's risen up. He's born in Ramah. He's raised under Eli the priest. God anoints him to be a judge and a priest over all of Israel. And he mostly judged in the central part of Ephraim. That's where he spent most of his time, through Shiloh and Ramah and so Gibeon. And this is kind of a transitional phase, because now the Israelites come out of the period of the judges. The Philistines are one of their main foes, and there's two battles that happen with the Philistines that kind of transition the Israelites a little bit. So we're going to look at that quickly. We have this place called Ebenezer and the Aphek. So the Philistines gathered at Aphek, and Shiloh is where the tabernacle was. When Joshua conquered, as we read, Canaan, the tabernacle was set up in Shiloh. It was there for 300 years. All through the period of the judges, the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant was held at Shiloh. And so the Israelites are going to go to battle. They're losing. They called to Shiloh to bring the ark, thinking the ark was going to deliver them. So they actually carried the ark to Ebenezer, and they lost. Israelites lost that battle to the Philistines. They actually stole the ark, and they took it back to Ashdod. And you can read about all that in 1 Samuel. And it was put before their Dagon, the temple of Dagon, which was a Philistine god. And the next morning they woke up and Dagon fell over. His head fell off. It's this big statue. And there was a curse that came on the people with mice and tumors and so forth. And so they took it to Gath, and then more mice, more tumors, more calamity. They took it to Ekron. These are all Philistine cities trying to get rid of this thing. And they've realized, we got to get rid of this thing. It's not working out for us. And so they took it back to the Israelites at Beth Shemesh. And then it was set up at Kiriath Jearim, the ark, and that's where it spent about 20 years before it was finally taken over to Jerusalem. So So that's kind of the story of the arc through this battle. But this battle at Ebenezer, the first one they lost. The second battle at Ebenezer, you can read about in 1 Samuel 7 to 14. They actually won. Samuel was kind of praying, and the Israelites repented to God, and God delivered them, and they actually beat the Philistines. And the Israelites wanted a king. They said, everybody else has kings. We want a king. Samuel said, no, God wants to be your king. But they wanted to have a king. And God says, give them a king. We're going to look at that. But before I look at that verse, I just want to show you some areas. This is the city of Gath, one of the Philistine strongholds. Right here, Gath. And this is the Valley of Elah, just out between Gath and Jerusalem. And this is where David slew Goliath. Remember, Goliath was from Gath. And we see that in chapter 17, I believe it is. And this is where the battle happened. So real places that you can go visit today. Our faith is based in history and archaeology. For the most part, most of the Bible can be documented with accurate history. And not every section, but most of them. And no other faith system or belief system has that. Not even close. Not even close. But you look at this, 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 9, Israel wants a king. And so I'm just going to read it with you. It says, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So God relented. He said, okay, they want a king, I'll give you a king. It's not the preference. And so that's when they found King Saul, who was very tall, very handsome, apparently from the tribe of Benjamin, from Gibeah, and the city of Gibeah. And he was anointed first king. And so now it ushers in this kind of a transitional period from this period of judges to a monarchy. So this is the monarchy of Israel. It's set up. We had 3 monarchs for the United Kingdom. We have Saul, then we have David, and we have Solomon, right? And this is called the United Monarchy because it's one nation, so to speak. And Saul ruled for about 25 years, and these are approximate, but they're fairly accurate. About 1025 BC to 1000 BC, 25 years. And then King David ruled for about 40 years, about 1000 BC to about 960 BC, give or take. But he ruled for 40 years, the Bible says. And then King Solomon ruled for 40 years as well. So about 960 to about 920 BC is King Solomon. Some people have 970 to 930, but right in that time frame. And so he ruled for 40 years. So interesting enough, it's not that long of a period that that Israel is united. It's basically a little over 100 years, right? A little over 100 years. And then we have the divided kingdom. But during this time, there's a lot of changes going on, a lot of expansion and so forth. So as we look at a map of the kingdom of Saul, as you can see, they have the hill country of Judea, all the way down to Beersheba, which is down in the Negev, the desert. It's an oasis down in the desert, so the southern part. They have all the east part of the Jordan that they conquered when Joshua first came up from Sinai, and Moses and Joshua and the Israelites, the Gilead area, all the way down towards Moab. And then they have Ephraim and Samaria and the hill country Ephraim. But they don't have the coastal plains. They still haven't conquered Jerusalem. The Jebusites are still in Jerusalem after all this time. And so there's still pockets that they have not conquered. But this is the king that Saul had. He was very successful against the Philistines and holding them back. And he expanded, and Israel started to grow as a nation under Saul. But then the division happened. He got jealous of David, wanted to kill David, and chased him for years. And this slide here kind of shows some of that. I'm not going to go through all this in this presentation. For those of you that are getting the slides, you can read through it. As you read through these events of Saul chasing David, these numbers like 5, 6, 8, 9 correlate with these maps here. You see these maps. You have these numbers. of different areas. So you can read through the words and kind of tell you the stories of where all this stuff happened. I'll just point out a couple to you. We have Adullam. These are the caves of Adullam, right near the Valley of Elah, where David slew Goliath. They have these big caves, and that's where David hid out with his men for a while. They're down here in Ziph, in the wilderness of Ziph, where David could have killed twice. David could have killed Saul, but he didn't. The first time was in Gedi, in the caves there. David snuck up on him and showed that he could have killed him and didn't. And then in the wilderness of Ziph, he could have killed him as well. But he didn't want to kill him. He just wanted peace. But Saul was, he just was deranged and wanted to kill David. So all these stories happen around these areas, from the north and Mizpah, Ramah, all the way down to this. David did go to Moab when he was running from Saul for a while. And interesting enough, he did have Moab relatives, distant relatives, because Ruth, as you learn from the book of Ruth, was his great grandmother, right? So he was in Moab for a little bit, but this is David running from Saul, and you read about it in 1 Samuel. And Gedi, this area here, is actually an oasis on the Dead Sea. It's one of the very few, it's probably the only really one on the Dead Sea, and it's like this valley with these different pools and so forth. It's very pretty, and some of the Psalms were written around in Gedi, like the one that David wrote, "As a deer panteth and drinks the water." Well, that was here because this is one of the water sources in that area, one of the only ones, and so forth. So in Gedi, you can visit it today. It's a park, national park, and very interesting. So then we have this period where Saul ends up dying. He's up here in Mount Gilboa fighting the Philistines. The Philistines overtake them and kill Saul, his son Jonathan, and his other sons. And then they take him over to Beth-shean and hang their bodies up, and the Israelites rescue their bodies. But the king is now dead, and he had one remaining son called Ishbosheth. And so now the kingdom got divided. So some of the people went with Ishbosheth in this area in the purple, and some went with David down here in Judah. Remember, David's from the tribe of Judah. And so David has this area here. And so we have two kingdoms for a short period of time. Ishbosheth ends up dying, and then the kingdom's united. And David sets up his capital at Hebron. So David sets up at Hebron for 7 years. It was 40 years was at Hebron, and then they conquered Jerusalem from the Jebusites, who had Jerusalem all along. It was hard to conquer Jerusalem because it was kind of on a ridge surrounded by three valleys. That's why it kind of lasted not under Israelite control for so long. But he did conquer. Then he ended up moving to Jerusalem, and that was city of David. That was the capital of Israelite kingdom. But as you see, David expanded. He had a lot of victories. He really got the Philistines to go to a much smaller area, really took over a lot of their land, expanded a little bit to the east, definitely to the north, all the way up to Phoenicia. And so under David's leadership, Israel expanded. And then God made a covenant with David. You can read about it in Samuel 7. I'm not going to read all the verses, but you can read it when you get slides. But I just want to read the last one to you down here in verse 16. It said, "And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever in accordance with all these words and in accordance with this vision." Nathan spoke to David. So God was speaking to the prophet Nathan, telling that David's kingdom will be forever. And of course, he was prophesying of Jesus, because Jesus was the tribe of Judah, the Davidic line. And so God was making a promise that the Messiah and the kingship that will last forever will come through David's line. As you look at Jerusalem, you kind of see it's in this area here just west of the Dead Sea, kind of a little bit northwest. And you have the city of David kind of on this ridge, the Ophel, and then you have the Temple Mount, which the temple was established by Solomon. And so this is the original city of David in Jerusalem under Israelite control. Okay. Fast forward to New Testament times, with Jesus, it expanded quite a bit. You have the old city of David here on that ridge. Then you have, of course, you have the Temple Mount, or the temple. Then you have the lower city, which is the poorer area. Then you have the upper city, which we had Herod's palace, and this, Sadducees lived here, and a lot of the wealth, of course, the high priest and so forth. And then you had the Tryphon area, and then this outer area. But yeah, this is kind of Jerusalem in Jesus's time, so you can kind of see how it expanded over the years from the original city of David. This is what it looks like today. Dome on the Rock. So this is present day Jerusalem. You can see the Dome on the Rock, which is up on the Temple Mount uh, today. So you can actually visit it today. You can go to the Western Wall, and that's Jerusalem now. Solomon. So Solomon became king when David died, and he was his son. And he really expanded the territories of Israel. Through trade, through ambition, through capital projects, through some wars, he really expanded. He had a lot of influence, even over the non-green areas, the purple areas. He had a lot of influence over Israel, and just really, really expanded the wealth and prosperity of the nation. This is the temple. This is the temple looked like in Solomon's day. It was up on the Temple Mount, which is very elevated. You can see it from very far away. Of course, it was gold plated and just it was beautiful. Just shined up on the hill around the city of David. This is a rendering of King Herod's temple. So Herod was added to the temple right before Jesus' birth, one of his building projects. And we have the court of Gentiles, a little expansion. It's quite large. But you have the same pretext as the temple. And then, of course, it all came from the tabernacle with the outer tent of meeting, the altar, sacrificial altar, the altar of incense, the menorahs, the shewbread, the Holy of Holies. That all came from the tabernacle. And then we can see it here in the temple. We still have the Holy of Holies, and then inside, and then the holy place on the outside, and then the outer court. So this is what the temple looked like in Jesus' time. When you look at Solomon, how he expanded the kingdom and the wealth and so forth, he just really went out. So in the Caribbean, all kind of trading partners went out to gold, silver, copper, went down to Aqaba, Gulf of Aqaba, Red Sea, with trading partners to the south, over in Arabia. And he just really had a lot of influence, a lot of expansion of Israel's influence. But when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam was supposed to take over, and he was actually going to get crowned here at Shechem. But the people came and they were complaining because they'd worked really hard under Solomon. Even though Solomon expanded Israelite influence and wealth, he really drove the people hard with all these capital projects, the temple building, the palace building, just all the stuff that was going on. And people were tired. And so they asked his son to just take it easy. And he went and got some counseling. He met with Solomon's counselors who were older and wise, and they counseled him, yeah, you should probably take it easier on the people. But then he also went and talked to some younger counselors, some of his peers, and they said, no, you need to be even harder. You need to build even more. And so he took their advice, unfortunately. So it caused the tribes of the north to rebel against Rehoboam. So Rehoboam ended up setting up Judah, the kingdom of Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as its capital, same. And then the kingdom of Israel kind of broke off, the 10 tribes to the north or so, and they had their capital here in Samaria. Then they set up worship centers in Bethel and Dan because Jerusalem was part of Judah, so they had no place to worship. And unfortunately, they let a lot of paganism come in and really went downhill from there with the different leadership. But this was what's called a divided kingdom. And it lasted for about 425 years. Two dates to remember: 722 BC, the kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians, and then 586 BC, 100 and something years later, about 130, 40 years later, you had the kingdom of Judah fell to the Babylonians, which we're going to look at. But this was the divided kingdom. You notice Israel did have Gilead over here to the east of the Jordan, and down south, they had quite a large area. And they both had about 20 kings, 20 kings, the kings of Israel here in red, and then the kings of Judah here in yellow. There was one queen, Queen Athaliah, for a short period. But when you look at the kings, the kings of Judah were all lineage of David, as God had promised in 2 Samuel chapter 7. But the kingdom of Judah, obviously, they had no lineage to David, and they had many different lineages, a lot of infighting, a lot of assassinations. It just, it wasn't smooth on the north. All the kings were pretty much bad except for a few. There's only a few good. None of the kings of Israel were good, the Bible says, and a couple of the kings of Judah were okay. But most of them, for the most part, were not. They didn't honor God, and they did evil inside of the Lord. And that was kind of the divided kingdom. This is actually a ruin in Dan. So if you look at Dan, which is way up here in the north, right? They set up two worship centers, Bethel and Dan. And you look at this. This is one of the pagan altars archaeologists found up in Dan. And you have these throughout Israel. I think I showed you one in Megiddo on a earlier session, and they're all over. But this is one up in Dan. During this time, though, during this divided kingdom time, during like the 800 BCs and so, you can read about it in First and Second Kings. You had a couple prophets rise up, the prophets of Elijah and Elisha. So this is when they ministered mostly to the northern kingdoms, to the northern kingdom. A little bit activity in the south, but not as much. Mostly focused on the north. And of course, King Ahab of the north married Jezebel, which was a Phoenician princess, and she brought her paganism into the kingdom. And then Elijah and Jezebel did not like each other, so Elijah spoke out against Ahab and Jezebel a lot. And you read about that in First Kings. But this is kind of a map of some of the ministries of Elisha and Elisha, these two pretty well-known, prolific prophets of the time. And so if you get the slides, you can kind of look through them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it just shows things like Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenged the priests of Baal, that Queen Jezebel, they were her priests and so forth. And you have up here in Tyre, up in Phoenicia, you have Elijah raising the son from the widow's son from death, and you have some things over here in Gilead that happens with Elijah. He was actually from Tishbe, over here in Gilead. So, yeah, these are those two prophets. So that's this time during this divided kingdom, the early part of the divided kingdom. Then we had the rise of the Assyrian Empire. They were already in existence when the kingdom was divided in about 940 BC. But they weren't as strong. Well, over the next 100 or so years, they really expanded, and they came and they expanded down into Judah. You have, and the Syrians were brutal. When they took over a place, they crucified people or slayed people, women and children. They took captives. They spread everybody throughout the empire. In other words, when they conquered an area, they'd take the people and displace them. They did the same with the Israelites. So if you look at about 722 BC, after many attacks and over a period of time, they were able to overtake the northern kingdom, and it fell to the Assyrians, and they were all displaced. This is kind of a map showing what that looks like. So you have Syria, their capital up here in Nineveh, right? And if you call Nineveh, before the fall of Nineveh, we're going to look at this next week. We'll look at the prophets, but that's where Jonah went. Prophet Jonah went to Nineveh. And Nineveh actually repented. This is 100 years earlier. But then Nahum, a second prophet that God put against Nineveh, the prophet Nahum wrote about their demise, and they ended up falling to the Babylonians. But at this time, when they conquered the northern kingdom, they were very powerful, and they invaded from the north through Haran. Remember Haran, where Abraham went, it was called, and came down into Aleppo and down, conquered Israel. And then the green is they took them out and they displaced all along. They dropped different people off here and there, and they just displaced the Israelites throughout their empire. And they brought in other people. So other people they conquered at different places, they brought in to Israel. So the northern kingdom, Samaria, Galilee, all that area was now inhabited by the few Jews that were left, but a lot of incumbents, and they mixed, and that's where the Samaritan people came from. They read about in the New Testament. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is where it all started. This was the first, what they call diaspora, Jews being spread outside of Judah, outside of Canaan, the homeland, and then it continues from here throughout for the next 1,000 years. So, and it has a lot to do with when we get into Paul's ministry, but we'll get there when we get there. But this was the first big exodus of Jews or the Israelites from the homeland to other places, called the diaspora. Interestingly enough, for many, many years, people thought Nineveh didn't exist. They thought it was just a myth of some ancient capital that didn't really exist. It was in the Bible, obviously, and other things, but they found it. In 1849, Austin Henry Layard, a British explorer, they discovered Nineveh, and this is one of the something they found there in the archaeology digs. And this is what it looks like today. You can actually go. Mosul is a city in northern Iraq that is right next to her, pretty much same city. It's a large city. And this is some of the ruins. And then this is an Akkadian ruler they discovered in 1931 when they were doing some excavation, and many, many other things. So Nineveh, a real place. It's been excavated, and just more proof. Archaeology, I'll say it again and again, is the Bible's very, very good friend, because the more they discover, the more it kind of ties into the biblical narrative. And so at that point, the kings of Israel are gone. Hoshea was the last king, and Israel is no more, kingdom of Israel. All we have left is the kings of Judah. the last several kings of Judah. They prolonged for another 140 years or so. And then we have the rise of the Babylonians. So they took over. There was a battle of 605 BC at Carchemish, right here on the northern Euphrates River, where the Babylonians came against the remnants of the Syrian Empire, who were actually partnering with the Egyptians. And they came against Babylon, and Babylon won. And that allowed them to keep coming through the Levant, where Israel is, on through as they spread their kingdom. Interestingly enough, shortly after the 605 victory for the Babylonians, they made their way down to Judah and started attacking the kings of Judah, and that's where they had their first deportations, their captives taken from Judah all the way to Babylon. Okay, and one of those early captives was Daniel. The prophet Daniel was taken from Judah, Jerusalem, basically, in 605. The next campaign where Babylonians were able to capture parts of Judah and take captives back was 597 BC, so about 7-8 years later. And that's when they took King Jehoiakim back as a prisoner. And that's when Ezekiel was taken back. And the prophet Ezekiel was taken to Babylon in 597 BC. And then in 586 BC, about 9 years later, the final siege of Jerusalem, where Zedekiah the king fell, and they overtook Jerusalem and tore the temple apart, decimated it, and tore up Jerusalem. And most of the Judeans that were left were taken to captivity, definitely out of Jerusalem, over to Babylon. And that started the 7 years of captivity that we're going to talk about next week. But it's all prophesied by Jeremiah and others, and Isaiah. And so that was the fall of the southern kingdom. And so now there's no more Jews or no more Israelites, at least in power, in the promised land. They've all been part of the diaspora. They're all been spread out, and they're on 7 years of captivity. Speaking of prophecy, so if you look at or not so much prophecy, but more, just some more archaeology that's very interesting. In 2 Kings, verse 25, verses 27 to 30, so this is towards the end of the book of Kings. This is actually the last verses of the second Kings. So you have 1 Samuel we covered tonight, which is the story of Samuel and King Saul, and then David running from King Saul. 2 Samuel is basically David's kingship when he comes into power and then rules. And then 1 Kings is Solomon. The first 11 chapters is Solomon. And then the rest of Kings and all of 2 Kings is a divided kingdom. The stories of the kings of Judea and the kings of Israel. Well, the very end of 2 Kings, now that Babylon's captured Judah and there is no more Israelite kingdoms in the promised land, this is the last verse. It says, and in the 37th year of exile, King Jehoiakim of Judah, in the 12th month of the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. So what this is saying is that when you had the Babylonians come through in those three realms, 605 first, 697, Jehoiakim was taken from Jerusalem all the way to Babylon as a prisoner under Nebuchadnezzar. Fast forward, right? His 37th year of his prison, it says, of his 37th year of his exile. A new king in Babylon came to power and released him from prison and put him at his table to dine with him and other important people and gave him an allowance. That's what the Bible says. What they found is, in some archaeological discoveries in Babylon, is what they call Jehoiakim's ration tablets, dated from the 6th century BC, and describes the oil rations set aside for a royal captive identified with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So they actually have a tablet that they found, or some inscriptions, talking about Jehoiakim's rations after he was released from prison and part of the king's rations, which matches the biblical narrative perfectly. So I find that very interesting. And it's always interesting when you have these ancient artifacts and things they find tie into the biblical narrative, because no other faith system has that. No other belief system has anything even close to that. You can't dissect it through history and archaeology and have it actually match the text. You can't find it except for Judaism and Christianity. And then we're going to close with this. I'm not going to go through First and Second Chronicles. I'm just going to show you the outlines because a lot of it's a repeat. So you have these two books, First and Second Chronicles. The first for First Chronicles chapters 1 through 9 is basically a huge genealogy from Adam all the way to David. It's just a big genealogy. And then the rest of First Chronicles chapters 10 to 29, it's all about how David rules and unites Israel. So you get more information about David's reign. You have some of it in 2 Samuel, and then you have more here, so it kind of builds on itself. Some of it's the same, but there is some new information. And then 2 Chronicles is all about Solomon. You get a lot of information on the temple. They mention it, I think, in First Kings a little bit, but a lot of the details in 2 Chronicles about Solomon's reign and especially the temple. And then that's chapters 1 through 9. And then 2 Chronicles, the rest of the book, chapters 10 to 36, is all about the kings of Judah from and all the way to the captive in Babylon. So there's no kings of Israelite mentions in 2 Chronicles. It's just about the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, up until their captivity. And so that ends the second book of Chronicles. As I mentioned earlier, they're now captive. The northern kingdom has been dispersed by the Assyrians and spread all over the place. No one's really sure where, even to this day. But the captives of Judah were taken to Babylon. But before they were taken, Jeremiah wrote this. Jeremiah prophesied about 70 years Babylonian captivity in Jeremiah 25:11 and 12, and Jeremiah 29:10. Chapter 25, he writes, this whole country will become desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation and the land of the Babylonians for their guilt, declares the Lord, and will make it desolate forever. And then chapter 29, he writes, this is what the Lord says, when the 70 years are complete for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise and bring you back to this place. Back to this place. So it was all part of God's plan. The Israelites brought it upon themselves for not being faithful, but God is just full of second chances. Again, he's going to show his mercy and give them another chance. So what's going to play out now, as we're going to look in the next couple weeks, is they're going to be 70 years in captivity. That's where Daniel and Ezekiel wrote their prophetical books. And then they're going to come back for a rebuilding period, and that's where Nehemiah, Ezra was written in Nehemiah, and then the book of Esther also appears about this time. But then we have all the prophets. So I'm going to go next week and we're going to dissect the prophets and show you how each of the prophets, the 12 minor prophets and the 4 major prophets, when they wrote and who they wrote to, because it all happened now in the period of the 1st and 2nd Kings under the divided kingdom. Started with Elisha and Elijah, but then the written prophets that we have in our Bible all come in play after that. And then we also have the 2 prophets, Daniel and Ezekiel, who wrote outside of Judea when they were in captivity. And we're going to line those up in the timeline and show you how they all fit into the narrative before we move on into the intertestamental period, which will follow that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.